So good morning and welcome to WashU Olin Business School's third annual healthcare symposium. I know many of you already, but those of you who haven't met me before, my name is Mark Taylor, and I'm privileged to say I'm the Dean of the Olin Business School here at Washington University in St. Louis. So the annual healthcare symposium is Disruption and Innovation in Healthcare 3.0, Accelerating Healthcare Innovation Out of a Global Pandemic. And I really do appreciate you joining us this morning. I'm looking forward to hearing from the experts with us today on this important, this very topical, ever-changing field of healthcare, and particularly in the context of what we've all experienced over the past year, I guess now, and we will continue to experience for several months ahead, I anticipate. Healthcare management is among the most important areas on which today's business leaders must focus. And WashU Olin offers students several opportunities to study healthcare management, which equips them with skills, knowledge, experience they need to become leaders in a time of disruption, in a time of innovation, global change. In fact, over the course of the summer, very own Professor Bart Hamilton and Professor Peter Baumgarten led a strategic planning process with university and regional healthcare leaders in which they were tasked to imagine the potential ways in which we will expand this engagement, right, moving forward. And you'll hear more soon about the ways in which this will be coming into further development in our current and potential expanded curricular offerings. But we've already started implementing a few of these initiatives. For example, this includes expanding the number of healthcare practicum engagements for our students to work experientially, get hands-on experience with leading healthcare organizations, formalizing our MD, MBA program with our colleagues at the medical school, increasing the touch points between our medical students and students at Olin as they listen and learn from leaders engaged in this work. And I guess generally working to develop a new Innovating for Healthcare course, which is modeled after the Hacking for Defense work done at universities like Stanford, and which is being implemented at WashU this year. Our students learn a great deal more than management theory and practice. They're trained to thoughtfully approach problems and decision-making, drawing on a strong understanding of both the scientific and the business ends of the healthcare industry. And thinking about healthcare industry, we're also pleased to partner with St. Louis's many healthcare organizations. And that's a mutually beneficial partnership. And some of those opportunities where we've partnered include attracting top talent to our graduate degree programs, providing employment opportunities for our students and graduates, developing experiential learning opportunities for our students, and we welcome the opportunity for further collaboration should your organization have a need that we can help you with. To the extent you want to hear more around what this kind of engagement could entail, please reach out to Bart Hamilton and or Peter Baumgarten in expressing ways in which this kind of engagement might naturally overlap with your work. Okay, so that's enough of me. It's time to get the symposium started. Our first panel discussion is tackling the topic, Exploring the Future of Drug Development. And I'll turn things over to our moderator, Peter Baumgarten, one of our distinguished professors of practice. Peter's been instrumental in putting together today's event, and he's sure to facilitate an interesting conversation. So please welcome Peter, who will introduce our panelists. Peter, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mark. It is great to see so many people out here on the line. I'm seeing it's 200 plus and climbing right now. This is always one of my favorite events, in large part because it bridges parts of our campus. We sit over here in the Danforth part of the campus, surrounded by the law school and arts and sciences and engineering and the like. And then over across Forest Park, there is a top tier medical school. And one of the things that I found when I was a graduate student here is I was always interested in the bridge between those two worlds. And as a faculty member, finding ways to work alongside our amazing faculty and working to bridge that gap. And so in a number of the things that Mark already mentioned in terms of programmatic offerings and changes that we're doing, you're starting to see pieces of that gap being bridged. And I think you'll see some of that bridging of the gap from a theory and perspective here in our conversations today. So we have two panels, and I want to just give you a quick overview in terms of how it's going to be structured. Unlike previous symposiums where we had a keynote followed by two panels, we know that no one wants to spend 4 hours on Zoom straight through the morning. So we have it essentially bundled into a shorter time together where we'll have about an hour or a bit under with our first panel and some time for Q&A at the very tail end. We'll take about a 5-minute break around noon, just enough time to go get your salad or sandwich, whatever you need to do, and then pop back in here at 12:05 for our second panel. All of this will take us to about 1 o'clock Central Time. So a lot to cover over the course of our time together, but I think you're going to get a great deal out of our time as well. So I want to welcome our first three panelists and give you some of their background bios. In fact, if I were to read all of their elements of the bio, we would be here until 12 o'clock already, because this is an incredible group. But let me just briefly introduce the three of them here. First, we are welcoming Kristi Martin. Kristi Martin has spent nearly 2 decades in DC, working both in the public and private sectors to develop meaningful, impactful health policy. Most recently, she was the vice president for healthcare at Arnold Ventures, an innovative philanthropic group committed to tackling some of the world's toughest problems through evidence-based policy work. Prior to that work, she was also leading the health practices of Henry Waxman's mission-driven consulting firm, Waxman Strategies, serving in the Obama administration as a senior advisor in health reform, amongst other roles. So an incredible background that she will be able to bring both the philanthropic as well as policy angles to bear on the equation. Second, we have my colleague, Mike Kinch. Mike was a member of that healthcare planning group that we were talking about in terms of the healthcare at Olin Future. He's the Associate Vice Chancellor, Professor for Biochemistry and Molecular Biophysics, and Director of the Centers for Research Innovation in Biotechnology and Drug Discovery at WashU. His research approach combines cutting-edge science with entrepreneurship to improve public policy. And at WashU, he founded and directs the Center for Research Innovation in Biotechnology, which analyzes innovation in the sciences and businesses of medicine. He also started the Center for Drug Discovery to identify and support the university's most promising drug discovery projects. And he has an upcoming book called The Price of Health, which tackles the history of drug pricing in the US. Going to be able to learn quite a bit from Mike today. And then finally, last but not least, we have Vineeta Agarwala, who is the general partner at Andreessen Horowitz, where she leads investments for the firm's biofund across therapeutics, diagnostics, and digital health, with a focus on companies that are leveraging unique data sets. This actually is a nice tie-in to some of Mike's work. Unique data sets to improve drug development and patient care delivery. Prior to her time at A16Z, Vineeta has held many different roles in healthcare space, a physician taking care of patients, an operator at tech-driven healthcare companies, and obviously a venture investor. She holds her BS in biophysics from Stanford University and an MD and PhD from Harvard Medical School and MIT. So we have an incredible group here and a great group to be in dialogue with one another. I actually want to start briefly with one small tie to WashU for Vineeta. So Vineeta, for the crew out here, can you explain a little bit of your WashU connection?
Yeah, so this was really fun when the information about the panel came in, but my sister-in-law is actually a faculty member there. And so pre-COVID, we were in St. Louis on a pretty regular basis. So it's really fun to kind of virtually pretend that that I'm in St. Louis with I think the majority of the folks dialed in to listen today. I've picked brick as my background, which I feel like is a staple there. And so, yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, great to have you here. And Kristi and Mike, great to have you involved in this particular session as well. So I'm going to start big picture to get us entering into this conversation. And in fact, Kristi, this came up when we were meeting the other day to talk about this symposium. But you made a bit of a distinction between innovation, or sometimes maybe we can put it innovation in quotes, things that appear to be innovation, but maybe are not invention in the same sort of way. Incremental things that maybe don't move the needle from the healthcare perspective. So we have, in this case, essentially someone who's representing the policy angle, someone who's representing the investment side of the house, and someone who's living close to the scientific side. I'm curious from each of yours perspectives, what can be done to make sure that we're seeing more invention, true invention inside your particular spaces, instead of just some of this more incremental innovation? And so we're going to take it from a couple different angles. Kristi, we're going to get you started because this is your key question here. As you think about either the role of a philanthropy organization, which you can speak to in terms of your previous role at Arnold, or from a policy perspective, what's required to move the needle towards invention over innovation?
Thanks, Peter. And thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be on the panel, being with everybody here today. So, I think from a policy perspective, whenever I'm talking to policymakers here or people that are engaging in the policy development process, we kind of take a step back and we say, okay, what's on the market and what's in the pipeline? And if you look at the last year or so, most of the products that are being approved by the FDA are not first-in-class products. And a large quantity of the ones being approved are actually line extensions or minor modifications to existing products on market. And so I think that makes everyone pause and say, okay, what's going on here? Why aren't we getting the innovation we think that we want, which is the really big finds, the really big discoveries, getting to an effective treatment for Alzheimer's, finding a cure for diseases that we've known about and we've been struggling to treat for years or even decades. And it comes down to what are the incentives? And I think it's trying to figure out how do we balance this incentives between innovation as a policy matter and price competition so that we can think about, okay, we have to make sure these drugs are affordable for folks. And so for us, it's really, in a policy world, it's really thinking about, are we presenting the right incentives that drive innovation? Are we presenting the incentives that actually encourage revenue generation, which I think are two different concepts?
And how much do those concepts overlap? Do you see these as disconnected Venn diagrams? Are they heavily overlapped? How do you see those from your perspective?
I think because of the change in the industry, and I'm sure Mike and Vineeta will have a lot to say about this, but 30 years ago, the way our industry was funded was very different in R&D. And I think with the change in how the industry is funded and how it's moved over time, they're very closely aligned. I think that, investors want to see their return on their investment. They want to make sure that they're, investing in something that will generate a revenue at some point in time. I think that maybe it is the innovation that we're seeing on the market today really worth the revenue that it is driving?
Okay, great. So Mike, I'm going to kick it over to you next, and then Vineeta will come back to you at the tail end to see the investor perspective. But Mike, what do you notice, either looking back historically around this invention, innovation distinction, however defined, and what do you think from a scientific perspective drives more of the former, the invention piece?
Well, I think when you look at the growth in science, it's been truly remarkable. And we know much more about disease. And so we're able to make more and better therapeutics. But like Kristi said, part of the problem is that our incentives, our carrots and our sticks, are not always aligned properly. And there have been a number of different examples where perhaps it's more lucrative, far more lucrative, to make something, introduce something that is less of a breakthrough. And there is a balance in the portfolio that most investors have and that most companies have between what's going to generate revenue and what's going to be a real breakthrough product. And I think that we need to realign or consider realigning all of the incentives and the carrots and again the sticks so that we can discourage what are known as Me Too drugs, fast follower drugs that really don't improve patient outcomes. They just generate a different stream of revenue, or perhaps, for example, medicines that are taken once a week instead of once a day. Yes, there's a certain advantage to it, but they're disproportionately priced and disproportionately used. So I think it's a huge subject that I just barely kind of scratched the surface on.
That's good. We only have so much time, Mike. We can't get through the entire thesis here. So this is good. Scratching the surface to start us off. So Vineeta, let's kick it over to you. You exist in this world of carrots and sticks from an investment standpoint. Some of what you feel aligned to drive you towards invention and innovation. Where do you see alignment? Where do you feel misalignment? And what could be done from the investor's perspective to drive more of this core invention innovation that we actually care about?
So I see a lot of alignment. I agree with the end goal that both Kristi and Mike are endorsing, which is that, look, we should be innovating in areas, that are primarily driven by, the ability to produce new and better therapies that actually change patient outcomes and improve patient health as compared to creating, sort of parallel revenue streams. I think the good news is that if you view investment dollars as a carrot, to use your phrase, that's exactly what they're looking for. That's exactly what we're looking for. So I think the carrot is very aligned with that outcome. And the sort of, I think a good reality of innovation in the biotech space from this perspective is that it always requires capital. We haven't yet figured out a way to produce new drugs, test new drugs, confirm that they're efficacious and safe without putting those drugs through expensive clinical development. We're very bullish on the idea that the dollars spent on clinical development per new drug approval can go down, and that there is a lot of room for software efficiency in that part of the cycle. But as of today, it still takes a lot of money and a lot of dollars to get to that point of a new drug approval and a new commercial revenue stream for a company. And so if we are still capital gated, and if capital still is an important carrot to help innovators and entrepreneurs decide where do we spend our energy, well, guess what? Capital is chasing the exact same outcomes, I think, that patients want. We're not investing in companies that have figured out minor modifications to individual assets. We're exclusively investing in technological platforms that have the ability to deliver new kinds of therapies and put better candidates than ever possible before into drug development pipelines. And from a return perspective, that platform piece is important for us. To know that the same platform can actually potentially generate multiple different therapeutics over time. And so I think that drive, combined with good people at all parts of this process, hopefully aligns everybody quite a bit with actually the patients at the end of the day.
So Vineeta, we're going to come back a little bit to your evolving view of where your thesis in investment might go moving forward. But I want to highlight one particular trend here in your 16 different threads and themes that we might see across healthcare investing in the next few years. In particular, you talked about the opportunity to find smaller markets, fund these more rare diseases. And I'm curious because I could imagine it being something where the incentives are aligned, the carrots are there for these really huge market opportunities. But at A16Z, you see opportunities to be able to really get after these very rare diseases as well. What does that look like from an investment thesis perspective?
Yeah, so I'm very curious to learn from Kristi on this topic, of course, but I'll just share a high-level summary here, which is that I think we're all seeing it, the extraordinary amount of investment dollars into therapies and into building pipelines focused on rare disease is at an all-time high. We might even be over-investing as a space in kind of therapies that look rather similar to one another for similar diseases. And a lot of this happened by virtue of policy changes that enabled accelerated drug development, accelerated approval, because of an era in which otherwise the R&D dollars might not have been justified because commercial revenue streams might have been small for very, very small populations. And then even as reimbursement has, or at least, is starting to move into a value-based care regimes, when you look at most rare diseases, current spend on treatment in some cases is very high, in other cases is almost non-existent. Patients actually, unfortunately, can't access much care because it doesn't exist. And so you can't necessarily even make the health economic argument in favor of a therapy. And so to combat that, I think what rescued us was actual technology innovation that kind of said, here's a path that makes both the commercial model make sense because you get to de-risk your technology first in a relatively more rapid clinical development regime in a relatively smaller population where there's extraordinary unmet need. But that same technology platform, you can then point and shoot, hopefully, at a large number of rare diseases or potentially even more common diseases. And that led to investment dollars for the same reasons that we just talked about, because we're looking for platforms that give companies multiple shots on goal. And that kind of, I think helps overcome some of the historical economic disincentives to innovate in rare disease therapeutics.
Great. So Kristi, you were essentially kind of teed up there to think about this from a policy perspective. What is your approach on the same question?
So it's really interesting. I kind of feel like the first carrots for orphan drug development were under Henry Waxman's pen with the Orphan Drug Act. And that was a huge shift in, I think, a lot of how we were thinking about orphan drug treatments and cures. And so from there, we've seen really a boom when it comes to orphan drug therapies. And, I think to get to Vineeta's point and kind of to circle back on where we're seeing drugs getting orphan drug approval that are not really orphan drugs. It's salami slicing at the end of the day. And so they're really confusing the difference between what is a treatment for a rare disease and what is a treatment for a subtype, a genotype of a more common disease. And I think that that's where the incentives have gotten misaligned in policy. And we really need to revisit where we are with the Orphan Drug Act and really think through how do we get more incentives into the space Vineeta is talking about, where you do have a patient population that's maybe 30,000, 40,000, and that's it. And that drug may only be used for that 30,000 people or 40,000 people versus the drugs that are grabbing the incentives for orphan drugs that have a treatment population and are also a blockbuster drug because their patient population is actually in the millions. And I think that that's definitely a concern for a lot of policymakers is how do we get to the right incentives to get to where we want to go versus just doing some broad strokes. The other thing I think that is interesting over time, we've also guaranteed coverage through policy. So in the early 90s, we had the Medicaid drug rebate program, which basically guaranteed coverage for outpatient drugs in the Medicaid program. Same thing happened with the Part D in the early 2000s with Medicare, and then ultimately with the Affordable Care Act, where we said prescription drug coverage is an essential health benefit. It's going to get covered. We're guaranteeing a market. And when you guarantee a market, I think that does reduce some of the risks because we know it's going to get paid for when it comes to market. I think it's a matter of what's the data to support how much we should be paying for it and how should it be paid for, whether it goes through a regular reimbursement scheme, or do we need to rethink how we're investing and how we're reimbursing? And I think some of the states are doing some really interesting models with subscription models for the Hep C cures. And so there's a lot of room to play there for redesigning the policy.
And that's where, if I could just chime in, I think the policy is the only way to help us get through situations where the health economics don't work out in favor of the patient. And so Hep C is a good example, let's say, where the alternative cost of care is very high. A Hep C patient without treatment will get hospitalized again and again, will become cirrhotic, will develop infections, will ultimately develop systemic disease. And the argument there, and you can make a calculation of, hey, a curative therapy up front saves the health system this many dollars going forward. There are a whole different set of diseases where I think the alternative is very low spend, but a quality of life and a patient outcome that, I think is not acceptable to us as a society. And so that's where I think policy can really move the needle to help us figure out these situations where the math will not compute and where we may end up spending more to make somebody better. But we should want that.
Vineeta, so I'm just going to put a point in this, and we're going to volley it over to Mike next here. So it sounds like to some degree there's a couple different distinctions. One, when the economic calculus, especially when viewed from the alternative treatment side, does make sense, but you need the right sort of value-based lens to be able to approach it. And then others where actually kind of getting to the financial calculus is a little bit more difficult. So it requires a different type of policy solution. Is that a fair way to frame that?
I think so. I don't know if Kristi, if you agree, but I think policy is the best weapon we have in those situations.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, with my actual background's in private insurance regulation and with the way that our health insurance system is designed to have a private insurer pay for the Hep C cure, and then maybe 10 years later, that person be on Medicare and Medicare reap the savings of that cure. That's a hard math equation to solve. And so I think it's really trying to be creative of how we think through those and maybe modernizing some of our systems along the way.
Mike, I want to kick it over to you now. You've been observing and watching kind of the history of drug development. You've been seeing how people price things over time. What nuances would you add to these same questions from your perspective?
Well, so there's two things. The fundamental underlying problem that is responsible largely for the escalating costs of drugs now, and I'm going to say that with an asterisk, is something known as Eroom's law. So the cost to develop a new medicine has been increasing at an exponential rate since the 1950s. And ironically, or perhaps not, everything that we've done as an industry to try to address Eroom's law has worsened it. And I would add the Orphan Drug Act to that. And let's put this into perspective. Every year we do an analysis of FDA approved medicines. In 2020, a year we would all, I think, like to forget to a large degree, 60% of new drugs were approved for an orphan indication, which on one hand is great. But if you look further, it turns out that the majority of those orphan approvals were for an oncology medicine. And there is nothing about that oncology application that will limit it to the orphan, the original indication. It's very likely through a process known as compendia expansion, going to be applied to other things. Well, the drug is being priced at a very high rate for that orphan disease, and you can justify that because there's a small number of people that have it. But that's frankly not the reason why that drug was developed. And one of the trends we've looked at historically is if you look at oncology drugs, in the 1980s and 90s, you would get 1 or 2 approved per year. Today, it's at least a third and usually approaching half of all new approvals. And it's because you can get a lot, you can price it very high, particularly if you have it under an orphan indication, but you can expand it beyond that. And so now you have a high priced drug that can be applied to many populations. And we're seeing with oncology that medicine prices are routinely now in the 6 digits, and we're getting occasional 7-digit oncology prices. And you could justify that for a genetic disease where you're treating a baby and then for the rest of their life, they're going to be effectively cured of a disease, but it's really hard to justify for a 70 or 80-year-old something to charge hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars for added productivity, added life. We're reaching that breaking point. And I think historically, that's what we're learning.
So Mike, I want to do one follow-up question there just to zero in on this. And then we're going to go to a few questions for each of you in particular based on your own backgrounds. But it sounds like there were 2 things raised there, and feel free to add others. But one piece of it is the intent behind the developments. What were you actually targeting for? And another piece was tied towards pricing, consistent pricing at a high level across different areas. What is the solution that you would look for in that space? Does intent matter? Does differential pricing solve the problem? How do you think about it from your perspective?
So, we clearly need to align our incentives with the public health needs. And we've seen a great example of that in the past year, which is that we will have a vaccine that will come in remarkable period of time. And there was a guaranteed market. Vaccines, one of the bits of our data has shown that we really have not increased the net number of pathogens we can target with a vaccine. Another way of saying we can't really protect any more diseases today than we did in the 1990s. And simply because there has not been incentives, proper incentives for developing and marketing vaccines. Well, we saw a huge incentive occur with COVID-19, and we saw regulatory loosening and I would argue realism in a lot of ways, and things that I think we can carry forward. But really the fundamental problem boils down to the fact that the price of these medicines has been increasing, and nothing we've done has been able to solve that. And frankly, again, it's always made it worse. But what's amazing when we were researching this book was that we found that R&D costs, even advertising costs, don't really factor into how a drug is priced. The pricing of a drug is what the market will bear, and the market has been bearing ever increasing prices. And at some point, and it looks like, I view it as the game of chicken. At some point, that is going to stop, and there's going to be the game of chicken where people are going to say, we're just not going to pay for that. And I think we're reaching very close to that point now, which has troubling implications for the industry.
So
if I could just say
Vineeta,
one thing here is that I do think I hear you, and I agree with the large majority of what you said, Mike. But the rare oncology indications are rare, and there's no other way to say it. I think, like, from the front lines, like, at least just looking at some of these patients, what makes them similar to the rare diseases, admittedly an older age and all the other points that you brought up, is that they are hard to find. You have to conduct a sequencing assay, and it takes a while to conduct a clinical trial with enough people to understand if the drug worked. And so just from the drug developer's perspective, I do think that presents a challenge. Maybe there are ways to make them easier to find and to leverage, population data sets to bring down that cost of development too. But that is a challenge that's similar to what the developers face. And I think we don't know yet how broadly they will be applicable. In many cases, they represent 2-3% of the population in very rare tumor types. And in the absence of those targeted therapeutics, those patients often have very few options. So I think that there are some parallels, not 100%, but some parallels to what was traditionally contemplated as an orphan disease.
Great. So Vineeta, I'm going to tee it over to you, and I want to view it from the perspective of an investment thesis, really zeroing in from the perspective of a venture capitalist, how they might approach it. So your background, as we heard earlier, is somewhat unique. You've worn a number of different hats within healthcare, a researcher, an operator, tech-driven healthcare companies in that space, and obviously a venture investor, as we've talked about. I wonder if you might be able to share yours or A16Z's guiding principles and overall philosophy when it comes to making some of these investments. So in other words, you're surrounded by these carrots and sticks, you see these opportunities out there. What types of spaces in bio and healthcare do you find particularly attractive or maybe underinvested from your perspective?
So our firm was started with kind of this statement that software is eating the world. And so 10, 11 years ago, our firm was started with the idea that, look, in every industry, there's a new and emerging role for software. Software can be developed more easily, tested more easily, deployed more easily, functions on, hardware that more and more people have. And so there must be, a way to kind of think ahead and figure out which industries software is most likely to disrupt. And actually, famously, when Mark and Andreessen and Ben Horowitz started the firm, they said it's not healthcare. They said the one place this is not going to happen is probably healthcare, and so we won't invest there. Quickly updated our view within 5 years of starting the firm to realize that no, we think that's changing. We think consumers are accessing software related to their healthcare delivery more. We think providers are now becoming addicted to important software that makes care quality better. And we think there will be software that infuses efficiency and productivity into biotech R&D as well. And so we hope it's not too narrow a lens. Our perspective is that it's very much the beginning of a wave of innovation that will be software and computation driven. But that is our core thesis, and that is the core set of companies that we are particularly fond of backing. Entrepreneurs who say, look, I'm going to bring software, computation, and engineering to an otherwise traditionally stated biotech or healthcare problem.
So I want to do one quick follow-up point there, but we have a number of people on the call that exist in a healthcare innovation ecosystem. So perhaps they're based down at Cortex, but maybe they're in the tech transfer office of WashU. Maybe they're based in innovative firms on the coast or here in St. Louis. Are there particular problems in healthcare that you wish more people would spend their time on, things that aren't getting the type of attention that they need?
This year we've seen teams addressing such a variety of problems that I think, with the exception of, I think the comments that Kristi and Michael made, I think are very real, that there's often a herd mentality towards indications where sometimes there already exist therapies. And so just because you think this is a way to get to a marginally better therapy, is less exciting. And so I get really excited about, indications, common or rare, where there's still so much unmet patient need. So, I think on indication selection, there's room for more diversity, but really we're seeing people apply computation to small molecule design, protein engineering for better antibodies. This year, a wave of companies, including those that developed COVID antibodies, got to antibody constructs with remarkable properties in a period of like weeks, which and many of them are not on the market. They're not the ones you're hearing talked about, but a number of software-driven platform companies have internal proofs of concept that really kind of demonstrated the ability of their technology to sort of rise to a problem. We're seeing computation being applied to gene therapy delivery vectors. We're seeing people apply machine learning to regulatory sequence design to help gene therapy achieve tissue-specific tropism, for example. There's a huge space of problems in the biotech and drug development world where we're very, very excited to see people come in with actually even no healthcare background, but a very strong interest and skill set in software engineering, machine learning, and data science.
So Vineeta, you identified a number of trends that are changing the space, the rapid evolution of a market that might even change A16Z's investment philosophy from no healthcare to we want to invest in healthcare. Kristi, from your perspective, one of the things that struck me in our conversation was the fact that you feel like there's times in which a certain policy is enacted and then the market starts to change. And so it might be somewhat out of step in regards to what's actually taking place in the space. And in your experience working on, again, with Henry Waxman on the Hatch-Waxman and Orphan Drug Act, amongst other things, what are the ways that we ensure that our policy is responsive to some of the radical changes that are happening in a space so that it does enable the right kind of incentives for the entrepreneurs to engage appropriately?
I think that this has been like why people get so frustrated with DC is because DC used to be really good about going back and checking on laws and, looking through them and saying, okay, is this working in the spirit of the law the way we thought it was going to work? How has industry changed? How are things being modified? And quite frankly, over the last probably 10 years, DC has not been working as well at that. We haven't been legislating as well. And I think that there's always this time where you have to go back and you have to do a review. COVID has been a really interesting experience where I think we've seen some of the how these flexibilities and modifications in policy at the agency level, in particular FDA, but also other agencies who've been engaged, are really trying to push things forward. And I think it's giving everybody food for thought about how do we modernize some of the laws that are standing to help encourage that. And I think, Vineeta, you brought up the really good point of the monoclonal antibody therapies. Remdesivir antiviral was the first that came out, first that got FDA EUA approval. And I think everybody was wondering, can we justify the price that Gilead was charging there? And is this really the treatment we want? And I think most people were like, nah, maybe not the treatment we want. But we kind of haven't figured out. And I think this is where you have to go back and see how the industry has changed, how the environment is affecting the policy and affecting the ability to get people access to care. The monoclonal antibodies have been remarkable, but the system cannot handle them right now. How do we infuse people before they get to a hospital? Where do we infuse them? Because most infusion centers are immunocompromised patient centers. And so that's an opportunity for policy to come in and to say, okay, there's been a change in how industry has responded because we've allowed them flexibilities and we've gotten this, what would be an innovative treatment coming to the market available to treat the pandemic. But we haven't figured out how to make sure the healthcare system is ready for it. And so I think that's a good example of you have to constantly be checking on things and making sure they're working the way you intended them to.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about any sort of innovation happens in a broader system, a system of pricing it, deploying it, so on and so forth. And any sort of gap along the way can prevent us from reaching the kind of outcomes that we desire. I want to kick it over to Mike here for a short bit. And in particular, I wonder if there's some lessons from your book on pricing and pricing strategies that might have implications post the actual invention of a particular drug. What can we learn by looking at other markets at the US in regards to pricing strategy that might shape the way that Vineeta might approach it as a future venture capitalist, as a policy-oriented person like Kristi might have to think about these problems as well?
Well, so one of the things that surprised us was the complication and how complex the system has become really over the last, especially 50 years, where R&D itself has become more complex as the science has increased, and that's been battling Eroom's law, but also just distribution has become more and more of a problem. And what amazed us is if you compare the purchase that it takes to buy a bottle of aspirin, and you look at the players that are involved and the players that are being paid, when you go buy an over-the-counter drug, and you contrast that now with a prescription medicine, and particularly, let's say, a prescription medicine that's delivered by one of the many places that will send it to you by mail, it turns out there are a lot more mouths to feed. And there have been entire industries, not companies, but industries, which then burgeon, all of which have been expanding in number, in complexity, and in cost. And the real fundamental question comes down to, is it worth it? And the real irony behind all of this was that if you look at, for example, pharmacy benefit managers, this was an entire industry that was created to bring down the cost of medicines. And ironically, PBMs are now accused, perhaps justifiably, I think probably so, but the data is so opaque you can't really get at it. PBMs are now accused of reaping more profits than any other industry, including the manufacturers or the inventors and discoverers. And so that's the problem, is that the complexity that had been intended to do beneficial things has kind of flipped over. Now, from a disruption standpoint, it's both good and bad. The bad part is that there's less and less incentive for folks like Vineeta and myself to go out and find the next medicine and to develop it. The good news, and by the way, that means our medicines are going to become, our breakthrough medicines are potentially going to become more and more rare. The good news is, when a field is as completely inefficient as healthcare discovery and delivery has become, that means there's an opportunity for huge disruption. And in one of my books, the section that I talk about this was, will the next Mr. Gates please stand up? Because there are billions and trillions of dollars that can be made just by efficiencies. And we could redo.
That's our siren call too.
Yeah. So the opportunity's there. We just need to be smarter in thinking about it. And there are many examples of how we can do it better. I won't go on and on, but basically that surprised us. I thought it was a problem of pharmaceutical manufacturers. And yeah, there is some contributions, but it's delivery that's even more inefficient than the R&D.
So Vineeta, I want to tee it back over to you then. So you said this is your siren call as well. What about that resonates with you, and how does that shape how A16Z approaches investment?
Yeah, so I think that is partially why, although, you know, the majority of our investment dollars are in biotech and brand new technology platforms for drug development and discovery, we started to see a lot of opportunities to interface with the broader healthcare system at large. And in fact, some of the lower hanging software fruit is probably there. And sometimes where we stretch a little more, you know, and invest in some of our biotech companies, you know, are really biology platforms and are really uncovering, you know, where the line between computation and value creation might be a little bit still of a bet. In the healthcare delivery world, it's even clearer, right? It's like, before you couldn't communicate with patients, now you can. Before you couldn't, you know, provide transparency into price, now you can. Before there was no marketplace to actually access durable medical equipment in a transparent way, like you can buy things on Amazon, now you can. And in all of those cases, software immediately creates efficiency and you know, and value for a lot of the parties involved in a very aligned way. And you know, and just to tee off both Kristi and Mike's comments on distribution being a challenge, for those of you in the audience looking for kind of one of the buzz phrases now in that space, you know, is site of care. There are a lot of companies that are saying, we're going to innovate on site of care. If you're looking at one of those companies or thinking about joining one of those startups, make sure you figure out what they mean by that. Do they mean moving patients from one doctor to a different doctor who they think might be lower cost of care? Do they mean moving patients from an academic center to a community center? Do they mean moving patients from a hospital setting to an ambulatory lower cost care setting or to home? But all of those kind of navigations of patients through the healthcare distribution maze, I think people are really thinking through that journey now more than ever before. And so site of care innovation, remarkably, something that feels so grounded in like not software, but buildings in a way, has become a really important avenue for efficiency introduction.
That's fantastic. So I want to take a few more questions here. We have about 15 minutes to go, and I want to just quickly highlight the fact that we have two of our amazing MBA students, Aparna and Shivani, on here curating through questions, but you have not yet made their job difficult enough. I want you to throw out some really tough ones, have them sort through the ones that we should be asking here of our panelists. But I want to see if I can get in two more questions before we go to the open thread with you all. And I want to actually hop for a little bit to Kristi. So we've been talking about this ecosystem of various different players, from policy to the scientist, to the investor, to the providers, so on and so forth. But we haven't spent too much time talking about the philanthropic arm of this story. And you spent a number of years, or a bit of time, I should say, at Arnold Ventures in particular, before transitioning onto your next work. But I wonder if you can speak uniquely to the role that we need our philanthropies, group like Arnold Ventures or Gates Foundation or others, to play in this particular ecosystem of care.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So, there's the philanthropies that are really trying to solve the policy problems. And that's where we get to Arnold Ventures and also West Health, Peterson Center, who are really trying to say, how do we take care of the laws we have to make sure that we're getting the innovation at the right price to the right patient. And then there's the philanthropies, and I think of the Wellbeing Trust and Gates, and even whatever Mark Cuban is up to. I'm not really sure. I think he could fit into that role too, who are really trying to make change and drive change almost as a market-based approach. And so I think that there's always room for philanthropy. I think that, without the Gates Foundation and the Wellbeing Trust, and then their ability to coordinate with private sector, including companies like MasterCard, I don't know that we would have Moderna vaccine. I don't know that we would have 200 plus vaccines in the pipeline. I mean, the level of engagement that we've seen on innovation with COVID is largely attributed to philanthropy, government, and private sector working well together. And so I think that that's an exciting opportunity, and maybe we can take some lessons learned from that approach and figure out can we, getting to Vineeta's point earlier, can we target these engagements so that we're getting the types of drugs and the types of treatments that really get to burden of disease where maybe we don't have any treatments or we don't have any cures available to us. So I think there's always room for philanthropy to be playing in the area. I think they play an important role, but they wear multiple hats.
Okay, that's great. So I want to go one more question to Vineeta here. So Vineeta, just recently, A16Z announced these 16 different trends that you believe will transform biology, medicine, and healthcare. And so these included things such as valuable data moving beyond EHR, biotech R&D going more virtual, continued focus on the development of novel therapies for rare diseases, as we talked about earlier on. I'm wondering, out of that particular list, which one or two you think might be the most controversial within the venture space, and what gets you some specific confidence around that particular thesis?
Yeah, so Peter, thank you for calling out. Our whole team came together last year and tried to come up with something tied to our name, A16Z, and came up with 16 trends that we think are really playing out now in both across the biotech and digital health spaces. A couple that I'd call out. So one, we're surmising that patient data outside of the patient health record actually might sort of surpass the health record in value, especially with an eye towards drug development in some instances. A lot of the efforts to learn from patient real-world experience and use that to understand patient populations and substratification and outcomes has been really laser focused on, well, let's make sure we can clean the EHR data. That has worked well. Some companies like Flatiron Health, for example, where I worked, have done a really nice job of curating that data, but we're starting to see a lot of trends related again to this site of care concept where, well, maybe patients are going to be collecting a lot of data at home. Maybe there's going to be new data streams that describe how they're really doing in a way that even their EHR data set does not reflect. And maybe that will be an even more powerful way to stratify them by their risk profiles and their outcomes and potentially what drugs would benefit them the most. And so that's kind of one that we're really starting to think about, big, useful data sets that are completely disjoint from the EHR. And then one other one I'd call out is we describe this concept of virtual biotech, or, kind of facetiously beach biotech, or a biotech that really can be run a little bit more like a software company, where there might be components that are outsourced to CROs and manufacturing organizations, and kind of tapping into this global network of talent. A lot of biotech will ultimately always require a lab and always require, infrastructure that's very, very real and tangible. But we think that, and this happened during COVID, by the way, we saw companies kind of move their R&D operations around nimbly all over the world, from a Chinese CRO over to an Italian CRO, and then back to a Chinese CRO, depending on where the COVID pandemic was most severe. And so there is a trend that we see coming, which is that historically biotech companies always felt like, wow, we have to really keep everything in-house. If we're not doing it, we don't, it won't be the best. But the space of knowledge is so vast that it also doesn't make sense to reinvent the wheel every time. And so we're seeing more really successful companies, really smart founders think, well, this is something that I can, outsource, and actually that's better for everybody involved. So those are a couple that I'd call out.
That's great. It's going to be great to see you all play in this space moving forward. I know many of us will be watching as you do so. I want to go to some of the questions. So you followed suit and you came up with some good ones. And I'm going to go first to Mike. And this is a question that's not necessarily targeted at you, Mike, but I think you might have some acute insight on. And it's in particular tied towards Amazon's plan for drug delivery and what it might do in terms of the future of drug pricing. So in fact, Amazon was one of the voices we considered bringing to the table for this conversation. We don't have them represented here today, but I'm curious, as you look at both the history of pricing and a new entrant into the delivery side, what that might do from a pricing standpoint.
So it's not entirely clear what Amazon has planned. They purchased PillPack, and I think everyone who's probably had a TV set on in the last year knows what PillPack is. One thought, and a lot of analysts think, that if Amazon decides to become a PBM, that they will wipe everybody else out. So the Express Scripts, which is obviously a local company, Caremark, and a lot of other companies will just become dominated by Amazon in the same way they've dominated book sales in a lot of other areas. But it's not entirely clear that that's what Amazon wants to be doing. So I think in part it's going to be a question there. Now, we do know from airlines and everything else that as you eliminate competition, you have a potential for dominance and prices to go up and efficiency to go down. So it will be interesting to see. I think it's too early to call. And whereas about a year ago, I think everyone assumed that Amazon was going to take the PBMs on directly, I think now it's not entirely clear what their intentions are.
And Kristi and Vineeta, feel free to weigh in on any of these questions, even if I target it towards Mike. If you have things that you want to weigh in, feel free to say that as well. Good. Well, we're going to go to another question because we got some great ones here. So I'm actually loving seeing many questions coming in from some of my former and current students. So love seeing that. I'm going to go to a question from Paul. Paul, one of our former EMBAs here. Asking the question around the role of policy in creating incentives for the implementation of change and innovation in healthcare delivery. We obviously have another panel right afterwards focus a bit on the delivery of care, but Kristi, from a policymaking perspective, what are some of the things that you see that might spur this type of provider-based or let's just say a delivery-based innovation more broadly in this sector?
Yeah, I think when I was working in the Obama administration, we had a huge focus on delivery system reform, which we're getting to a lot of the site of care issues that Vineeta was bringing up. And I think that there is a lot of interest into trying to figure out how do we disrupt and redesign our system to create the efficiencies that Mike was talking about. And we're seeing those work in certain instances. I think that the interesting part is COVID's kind of unveiled like where they work well and where they don't. And so one of those are a move toward accountable care organizations or bundled payments. So where we're paying for patient experiences with their care versus paying for each line item that is being billed to the plan or from the provider. And I think those types of items are like areas where we can advance policy even more. I think when it comes to prescription drugs and therapeutics, we're starting to see, I mentioned earlier, the subscription model. So that really rethinking about how do we purchase something that is for the public health and a public health need. And I think that people are thinking about how can we apply a subscription model or advanced purchase commitment in the realm of HIV and AIDS care. Can we think about that in terms of PrEP? And so there's a lot of opportunity. I think that people in policy are really wanting to see some innovative ideas about how do we rethink reimbursement for drugs.
Perfect. So there's a question from Gary here that we're actually not going to answer right now, but I want to highlight it as potentially a theme to cover in our next panel. There was a question here about, aside from robotics, what might we see in terms of innovation in surgery? We have the benefit of having Karen Parkhill here, who might be able to speak about their broad approach towards development in the device side. But I want to take one that's a bit broader here. In fact, this is something that I had on my list to cover that I wasn't able to cover in our space here, and it's going to really broadly apply across all three of you. But it's really dealing with the momentum that we've seen over the last year in R&D and innovation inside healthcare tied towards COVID. What would it look like, or what would it take for that same sort of momentum to continue and to extend outside of COVID to other sectors? This is, I think, on top of mind for a lot of people. We can look at this and say, amazing that we're now starting to get vaccines out, especially in comparison to the timetable for previous vaccine development. It's pretty astounding. And yet the question remains, what can be done to make sure that momentum applies to other areas moving forward? So why don't we end with a bit of a round robin on that to conclude our section together. Vineeta, we'll start with you. We'll then go to Mike, and then we'll end with Kristi. Each of your different perspectives elucidating certain parts of that story.
Thanks, Peter. So my perspective on this is going to be based on the technology. And I think one way to look at the COVID vaccine success is just to recognize that, it was a little bit of the right technology available at the right time, but COVID alone did not really, develop that technology. It was brewing. And this was kind of a great opportunity to see if that platform could deliver, which it did. So I think, we're very hopeful that those same platforms are now going to become more and more productive and sort of, so to speak, be the geese that lay many eggs, but there's still more technology there, right? People are saying, oh, well, now we can make mRNA therapies for any type of disease. Not really, right? You got to get, for most other diseases, you need to get that mRNA to the right cell in the body, which might be a much harder it is a much harder hurdle than generating an immune response. So I'm very hopeful that the platforms will deliver and that there'll be more investments to make the platforms even more powerful.
I'll just echo that briefly, by the way. If you look at the history of innovation with writers like Robert Gordon, for example, oftentimes what they talk about is that there is invention, and then you're actually not going to see the downstream GDP effect until 10, 15, 20 years downstream, whether that's electricity or video conferencing or the development of platforms that enable healthcare innovation. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out as we seek out more innovation. Mike, what's your take on this same question? How is the momentum sustained?
I think we have seen one of the really good things is that we've unintentionally done a lot of experiments, particularly as it pertains to regulatory interactions. And when the FDA can collaborate in the true sense of the word with the private sector, the results are amazing. The money behind that went into these companies certainly helped. But I think that there's been an unprecedented level of collaboration that we haven't seen since maybe the HIV/AIDS outbreak in the late 80s and early 90s, but I would argue we even exceeded that as far as time, because it took a while for FDA to kind of get going. We need to build on that. But we've also seen some downsides. As Kristi pointed out, the remdesivir story is a disaster. The monoclonal antibody story is mixed, and the vaccine story, so far at least, has been fantastic. And so we have to figure out what enabled that and how do we continue that momentum to apply to Alzheimer's and COPD and metabolic diseases. But I think there are great opportunities at the regulatory level to really look at FDA and say, good job. My colleagues at FDA always say that they think they're underfunded intentionally by the government to keep them from being innovative. But I think that's something it sounds paranoid, but it's something we should investigate and ask, are there opportunities to improve even further moving forward beyond just COVID?
Fantastic. So we are going to end it with you, Kristi. You are now migrating more back into the policy world for the next little bit. What needs to be done from a policy perspective to engender the kind of innovation that we need extending outside of COVID?
I think kind of circling back on Vineeta's point, a lot of the science and discovery was done 20 years ago that got us to where we are today with the COVID vaccines. And so I think some concerted effort and investment with NIH and FDA and other agencies to make sure that we are actually investing and providing the right sticks and carrots to get innovation where we want it and really building it out, because it's going to take time and it's going to take a commitment. And I think we saw that in the late 90s and early 2000s with huge investments going into National Cancer Institute. And now, as Mike would say, look at all the oncology drugs we have on the market. Those are linked. And so I think that it's taking a step back and saying, okay, what's the next big problem to solve, and having a concerted effort to really engage on all levels of the government and policy to drive toward that goal.
Fantastic. Well, you are right on tap for timing there, Kristi. 12 seconds beyond our slotted time. But I wanted to thank Mike, Kristi, and Vineeta for all of your insight and wisdom shared across the time. I think I am echoing the entire audience in saying that you have given us a lot to chew on in regards to understanding this sector moving forward. So appreciate your generosity of time and spirit in regards to your engagement here.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, and I'm loving the red brick. So next time, Vineeta, we'll have you here in person with the real deal.
I can't wait to come back to St. Louis.
Great. Well, for those of you here, we're going to take a quick 5-minute break. You're going to see a little countdown timer coming up, and then we will welcome us back in, and I will kick it over to my colleague, Tom, to enter into our second panel. See you shortly. Well, welcome back, everyone. 5 minutes can go so quickly as we are quickly searching for opportunities for lunch or a cup of coffee for our second panel. I am incredibly excited about our second group. In fact, I'm going to have my colleague, Tom Maddox, introduce the crew here in a short bit. But let me quickly introduce you to Tom. So Tom Maddox is the inaugural Executive Director of the Healthcare Innovation Lab at BJC Healthcare and WashU School of Medicine. The Innovation Lab catalyzes care delivery through research and development. They've developed innovations in predictive analytics, critical care, palliative care, remote patient monitoring, amongst other things. He is a practicing cardiologist, a professor of medicine at WashU School of Medicine, and also a health services researcher. His research interests have focused on healthcare delivery innovation, so some nice ties to our last conversation, learning healthcare systems, and also the quality of care in cardiovascular disease. Every time I see Tom's list of publications, I feel insecure at my lack of productivity, but there are 230 peer-reviewed publications on there amongst a number of other things that he's been involved in. So Tom is the perfect person to guide us into our second conversation, and we got a great group of people to be able to engage with along the way. So Tom, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks, Peter, and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the second half of our discussion today. I'm thrilled to listen to, along with you all, to our three panelists, and we'll be talking around accelerating innovation and operational excellence in the delivery of care. So today we have Alex Garza, who's the Chief Community Health Officer at SSM Health here in St. Louis. He's also been serving for the better part of the last year as the incident commander for the St. Louis Metropolitan Region's Pandemic Task Force. We also have Matt Herman. He's the Senior Managing Director at Ascension Ventures, which is a healthcare-focused venture firm. He's been in that role for a better part of 20 years now and has a lot of experience and insight to share. And then finally, Karen Parkhill, who is the Executive Vice President and Chief Financial Officer for Medtronic. And we're looking forward to hearing all of their respective insights. So just like we did with Peter's panel, please input your questions into the chat. And what we'll do is spend the next 45 minutes or so, 45 minutes, just talking amongst the panel, and then go through your questions and make it more of a conversation. So to start off, I would like to actually turn to Karen, and she comes to Medtronic and to healthcare actually from a career in banking, not traditionally in healthcare. And I'm always fascinated talking to folks relatively new to healthcare, since it's been my career, and get their perspective on how's it been, what have you, what brought you to healthcare. And then tell me a little bit about your perceptions, at least to date, on healthcare operations and some of the nuances of the healthcare industry, given that it's a newer focus for you.
Well, thank you, Tom. I appreciate it. And honestly, I feel like I've found my home and come back to my roots the last 4 years in healthcare. While I did spend the vast majority of my career in banking, I have to admit that I am the daughter of an orthopedic surgeon and nurse. And so that's why I feel like I've come back to my roots. I also feel like I can do what I love in the world of, finance, but also, serve a higher purpose in healthcare, and particularly at Medtronic, where we have such a strong mission tied around alleviating pain, restoring health, and extending life. In terms of my observations on healthcare, there is so much innovation happening in our world, on a minute-by-minute basis. And, harnessing the power of that innovation and ensuring that we use it for the common good and that we fund the things that need to be funded so that we can drive better care, better value, better breakthroughs in cures is super important. And I love being part of driving that innovation.
That's great. I guess one follow-up question, just more specifically to the pandemic. Somewhat early on in the pandemic, Medtronic made the decision to release some of its ventilator technology a little bit to the open market and share that broadly, recognizing that at least early on, we were concerned about having enough ventilators in the market. And I'd just be curious, you're obviously in part of the leadership conversations around the pros and cons of doing that. Share a little bit of that reasoning and the cost and benefits you guys considered in making that decision.
Yeah, thank you. Wind the clock back to last year at this time when the pandemic was really in China, but there was fear of it moving globally. And there was a significant fear around ventilator shortage around the globe. And we were one of the few ventilator manufacturers in the world. And to Medtronic, it's honestly one of our smaller businesses. But it suddenly moved into the limelight as the most important business at Medtronic. And, fast forward to March of last year, we were getting calls from heads of states around the world and governors around the country and the White House about, how we could fulfill, the ventilator needs. We focused on increasing our ventilator output production fivefold from the month of January to the month of June. In January, we were producing about 200 ventilators a week, and by June, we were producing 1,000 ventilators a week. To increase in that rapid fashion is a feat in and of itself. But I think one of the most remarkable things that we did at Medtronic was we knew that no matter how fast we could or how much we could increase our output, we were not going to satiate the demand out there for ventilators at the time, and we knew the urgency required. So honestly, it was our business leadership team that made the bold suggestion that we post our intellectual property for our lower end ventilator, which is a little easier to manufacture, widely on the internet for anybody to be able to download and be able to manufacture. And for a company to give up its intellectual property like that is very rare. But it was a no-brainer at Medtronic. We knew that we had a huge corporate and social responsibility to help with this pandemic. And so the minute it was suggested is the minute we all got on board and said, absolutely. And so since we have posted our intellectual property, we've had 200,000 downloads around the world of that IP. We've had manufacturers work to not only help with the manufacture of parts of our ventilator, Foxconn, Tata Group, but we've also had smaller entities work to try to manufacture too. And so, it was an easy decision. And honestly, in hindsight, it has helped Medtronic be more recognized for a company that really focuses on social good.
Yeah, no, it's a great decision, obviously, and fascinating to hear the numbers of people who took advantage of releasing that information. Alex, let me turn over to you. On the pandemic side, obviously, this has been unfortunately your bread and butter for the better part of the year. For those of you who don't know, Alex is sort of uniquely suited to this role. He's had a variety of roles over time in the federal government, in the Department of Homeland Security, also in the U.S. military, and then has been at SSM for the last number of years, first as Chief Medical Officer before moving to the Community Officer role. So Alex, maybe thinking about your role with the pandemic response here in St. Louis, you have had to work with a variety of healthcare systems, and it's probably opened up both the potential and maybe some of the rough parts that our various healthcare systems have. And so hopefully, as we start to move into a more stable place, hopefully by the latter part of this year, what lessons should we take away? What lessons have you observed about how our healthcare delivery system is working and where we might really want to focus on improving that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Tom. And thanks, Washington University, for inviting me as well. So before I jump into the answer, I did want to recognize that it is Groundhog Day. And I woke up this morning and I saw my shadow, which means the pandemic is going to go on for another 6 months. So apologize for that. Well, but getting to your question there, Tom, one of the things that I did notice was, there's a lot of incredible talent within all of the healthcare systems in St. Louis. I think St. Louis is very blessed to have, the healthcare systems that it does, as well as the major universities. And so I really think that that is a key asset. And they're also extremely well run. The sort of intangibles, though, that I think made this a unique partnership for the pandemic is that everybody sort of got along with each other. So there was no sort of major egos that got into the way of forming a really valid and productive partnership. And so that was, I think, what really drove this. Some of the challenges that we've had are just what you would expect with different healthcare systems. Each of us brought sort of a different look or a different feel to a wide-ranging problem. And so, for instance, some of our healthcare systems were able to ramp up a testing platform pretty quickly because we had that infrastructure in place and had the personnel and all of that, where others were, caught a little behind the curve, not really behind the curve because they had no idea that curve was coming, but had to have some ramp up period in order to get really productive and things like that. Everybody shared the same problems with personal protective equipment and personnel issues and things like that. But where we could find common ground is where we really came together, especially in those early parts, especially around like policy and procedure and things like that. We didn't want there to be really any daylight between the different healthcare systems. I think the other challenge is we knew that we couldn't do this alone. So the healthcare systems couldn't do it alone. Which is why the task force was formed to bring other people into the collaborative. We focused on what we do best, which is acute care delivery. But even with that, and I think everybody understands from the media, there's still a limit on the number of ICU beds that you have. There's still a limit on the number of ventilators that you have. There's still a limit on a lot of things. And so trying to maximize capacity to meet demand was extremely challenging. And then the last point I would make, Tom, is that even with, I think, our far reach and our breadth, there's still people that are going to fall through the cracks. And making sure that we were doing as much as we could to reach out to communities that were at risk and identify those populations and help them out as best we could. Was a challenge as well. But again, we tried to partner with the health departments and the federally qualified healthcare centers and other community partners to make sure that we weren't missing anybody. And so, at the end of the day, it made for a really formidable group that came together.
Yeah, no, it's been impressive to see the group work in concert as they have. One question that occurs to me from your perspective as a collection of health systems, you have necessarily needed to work with the public health infrastructure in Missouri. Mm-hmm. And you've also probably paid attention to how other states and counties have done it around the country. And in many ways, we've been running a bunch of experiments all at the same time.
Right.
Missouri just politically and historically has not had as strong a public health infrastructure, and there are pros and cons to that approach. But I guess as you look at this and you think about going forward, would you advocate for differences in the way that Missouri and St. Louis approach their public health infrastructure, and what would those be?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So in addition to those other roles that I've had, I was also an associate dean at SLU's College of Public Health, and so I feel really this is an important topic to me personally. And you're absolutely right that funding for public health has suffered in the state of Missouri, and it has nationwide, but particularly in the state of Missouri. And that you sort of get what you pay for, and so that has shown up during the pandemic as well. Years ago and in other countries, there's not as much of a separation between healthcare delivery and public health. That schism seemed to have happened, centuries ago, and we've been fighting it ever since. But to your point, there does need to be more collaboration between those public health entities and the healthcare delivery system, and really is to maximize benefit for community health, which is one of the role that I'm moving into now. I would say prior to the pandemic, I had worked with the health department, but not nearly to the degree that we are now. One of the things that we've come to understand is healthcare delivery system, and I don't think it was anything new. It was amplified during the pandemic. Is is that there are communities that are more at risk for disease, and I think we all know that. But this was just much more significant because it was so rapid in the way that it happened. And so, that brought to the forefront this really need to focus on community health interventions more so than, the absolute delivery of medical care. Because at the end of the day, if we can prevent somebody from getting sick, that's better for the patient, it's better for the community. I would argue it's better for the healthcare system as well. But it's brought a lot more focus on that part of health.
No. Matt, I think let's turn over to you. I'm going to change the subject a little bit away from the pandemic, and maybe take advantage of your 20 years or so in the venture capital community and its involvement in healthcare. And I'd love your perspective, just over the last 20 years, how have you seen the role of venture capitalists like you in healthcare evolve? And where have you seen some trends take hold?
Well, thanks, Tom, and thanks for everyone for being here, and leadership from folks like Dr. Garza, both as a frontline caregiver and a leader to help get the vaccine disseminated. But yes, I've had a very interesting seat the last 20 years, and I think you need to understand the environment and what Ascension Ventures is first, before my comments all have meaning. To start, Ascension Ventures is a wholly owned subsidiary of Ascension, which is one of the largest Catholic health systems in the country. It's about a $26 billion health system headquartered in St. Louis, and with a real focus on transforming care delivery and providing the highest quality care to all individuals in the communities we serve. At the Venture Group, our job is to look for solutions in the services, software, and device and diagnostic world, the exact areas that complement what Vineeta was saying from the first panel, and find solutions that could materially improve the performance, the care quality, the cost delivery equation for our health system partners. Over our years, we've been fortunate enough to work with 18 different health systems. And what we're seeing right now is this highly correlated moment in time where a lot of the things we've been talking about as venture investors, our health system partners are talking about and actually doing. For example, when I started at AV, health systems were risk averse. Today, they are leaning in on risk. When I started, health systems did not have venture funds or innovation groups. Today, almost all do. Today, health systems are looking at businesses and opportunities through the very similar lens that we do at Ascension Ventures. The decision-making speed has increased to look a lot more like a venture or private equity firm. And what this is doing is highlighting the enormous opportunity that sits in front of us today. I've been doing this for about 30 years. I've been through Clinton care in the early 90s, been through the promise of the internet revolution in 1999, and today the incredible opportunities that exist because technology, the management talent, and the science has caught up is really positioned to help us make this last transformative leap so that we can have the care delivery systems that we will need when we get older.
It's great to hear that perspective, and I guess I'm excited to hear that you think healthcare is less risk adverse. I might quibble with you a little bit on that, simply because some of the regulatory safeguards that are in place, at least attempt to be safeguards, and then some of the reimbursement realities seem to prevent some of the things that I see, some innovations that are out there that have a lot of promise, don't take hold quite as quickly. Maybe reflect on me a little bit that is that accurate from your point of view, and where do you see things developing, if at all, to help improve that?
So Tom, what I would tell you is I think the pandemic has accelerated several trends that are going to continue. First, this movement to the home. It's not stopping, and the changes in reimbursement and regulatory around telemedicine, consumers, physicians aren't going to want to go back, and those that do go back are going to find alternative providers. So what I'm seeing is healthcare starting to look like other verticals. Yes, there's the do no harm mantra that comes first, and that's really important when we're dealing with human life. But I am seeing risk taking, not just on the margin, which is the way we used to see it, but at the core that is really trying to create huge changes so that the delivery system can deliver the highest quality care at the lowest cost in a way that the consumer wants to receive it. This movement to the home is not to be understated, as the health system of the future is going to look very different, and there will be a lot more ambulatory services, services that I believe will be provided directly to the consumer so that those relationships get established before the consumer gets sick.
Yeah, yeah. Karen, actually, that takes me to the news that we heard that Medtronic partnered with Blackstone on a diabetes management program. And I know that your innovation portfolio is actually quite broad, that you take stakes in a variety of companies to advance Medtronic's innovation efforts. Tell me a little bit about those plays and kind of how you and your team think about the portfolio of innovation for Medtronic.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. So maybe I'll start by putting it in context a little bit. We spend over $2.5 billion a year in R&D. It's just under 8% of our annual revenue. We'd like to spend more, but we also need to deliver to our shareholders. And so to supplement our own internal R&D, we acquire companies every year. We acquire, we spend $2 to $2.5 billion on average a year acquiring company. And we acquire from early stage to revenue generating, but we're skewing more toward early stage innovation where we acquire. We also have a ventures portfolio where we've invested $500 million in companies as a venture investor too. So we're attacking this at lots of different angles. But recently we did partner with Blackstone to supplement our own internal R&D. Blackstone will invest over $300 million in our diabetes program to advance our artificial intelligence and algorithms around our diabetes insulin pump. And that investment is something that we would have spent on our own, but it enables us to spend our dollars in other ways because Blackstone is funding it. It does mean that when we commercialize the product, we will pay Blackstone a royalty for that investment for a certain number of years up to a cap. But we view the return on that investment, that royalty that we ultimately have to pay, as a better return than we would get from M&A. But not so great a return as we get from our own internal R&D. So it's sort of in the middle of the spectrum. And it's a great way for us to be able to fund more of the innovative ideas that we have at Medtronic. And we're going at it at all angles. Yeah.
And tell me a little bit more about the diabetes play. I think traditionally, and I think it's still true, a bulk of Medtronic's products are products as opposed to services in the healthcare space. But as you know, the real outcomes occur when you marry good product or products with good service delivery. So how do you think about that? Is it partner? Do you try to take on any of the service innovation? What's sort of the philosophy there?
Yeah, absolutely. So many of our products requires, ongoing focus and service. Diabetes insulin pumps is one of them. And with the new pumps that we're about to release, we talked about software in the last panel. Software is so incredibly important to our devices today, not just our cardio devices, but also things like our insulin pumps. And the artificial intelligence that we're driving in these devices is software driven. And we will have Bluetooth capability to be able to upgrade that software, as we develop it over time. And so there is an ongoing service component to all of our devices just from that angle, but even way beyond.
Right. Yeah. The software as a service model is obviously under quite a bit of scrutiny, both in terms of its efficacy, but also how do you effectively oversee that and ensure its safety. Alex, maybe let me turn to you. We've heard from Matt and Karen how for-profit, well-capitalized efforts can help with healthcare innovation, which is really important. You've lived in some other different industries. You've lived in nonprofit healthcare where you are now. You've lived in the military. You've lived in the federal government. All of those industries have their own ways of showing up in healthcare innovation. And I'd just be curious about your observations looking at those industries. Where did you see useful models of innovation, and how can they inform the other industries in ways to do it well?
Yeah, that's a good question, Tom. So, each is very unique, depending, because they each have different missions, right? And so they have to be innovative in many different ways. Some of them are extremely technical, highly specific, and not that Medtronic isn't or anything like that, but they have some really niche markets, and they a lot of times they won't do the innovation themselves. They contract or subcontract out. So let me give you an example. So when I was working at Homeland Security, I was in charge of a biosurveillance platform that looks for pathogens in the air of major cities, and to make sure there wasn't bioterrorism attacks occurring. And so that was it was a sophisticated program. It relied on actually some pretty dated technology, but then trying to innovate on that idea to produce a next generation of how do we build the next sort of technology to look for biologic pathogens. It was a huge leap for us. And if you know anything about the federal government, then it has to go through a ridiculously long and Byzantine process to solicit bids from an RFP and all of these other things. But nonetheless, the technology that comes out of a lot of those things has these other spin-offs. And so what I used to tell people is, this isn't like a zero-sum game that only is for this particular niche thing. Because we explored in this area, other people saw it and said, you know what, we could use that for this other problem as well. So they can take that technology and put it towards other issues. In the military is a little bit, in some ways they're very similar to Homeland Security. The DoD has, of course, these fantastic research and development departments, whether it's DARPA or IARPA or these other, four-letter agencies, and they do really just top level innovation there. When you get down to the ground level, though, so I spent a year in Iraq. Innovation becomes very focused on what is your immediate problem. And so one of the things that the military, I think, is pretty good at is identifying what is my immediate problem on the ground, and then how can I innovate to overcome that. So they sort of span all the way from teaching how to be innovative at the squad level to this very high end sort of technical stuff at the highest levels as well. And then in healthcare, in some ways it sort of lives in between all of those worlds, but it's very focused on delivery of healthcare. But I think moving farther forward into how do we take care of the whole of the individual, especially when it comes to sort of payment and things like that. So obviously you want your covered life to be as healthy as you can. So for many reasons, the most significant is you want people to be healthy, but secondarily you also save money when they're healthy as well. And so using what was talked about with home-based technologies as well as other sorts of algorithms and communication devices to make sure that you can deliver for that participant to make sure that they're able to stay healthy, not just sort of delivering the insulin, but also, hey, how can we make sure that you're eating well, that you're getting exercise, that you can make it to your doctor's appointment? All of that gets pulled together into an innovative structure.
Yeah. No, it's a great contrast. One question that it makes me think about is organizations. I'm trying to think of the best way to characterize it. Organizations that have a very large mandate and a bureaucracy that accompanies it, be it the government or the military or whatnot. In some ways, I wonder if that kind of entity is better suited to buy rather than building innovation. And much like Karen's example with Blackstone, do you want to think about, or is the right model to really think about the partners more in the private sector, have a bit freer access to capital and can move a bit quicker, but the government's going to provide a policy environment for that to move, and you're going to have some huge delivery systems available to you. Is that a good model to think about? What are pros and cons of that approach?
Yeah, so I think it's a balance with the government or with the military. So obviously, they let out RFPs and have vendor days and have everybody come and sort of, show their wares and what they can do. The military and Homeland Security will put out their guidance documents as, hey, we need you to do these, 10 things, and to be able to do them in all environments and all of these other requirements, and then allow the private sector then to go out and do what they do best, which is innovate and build technology, and then bring it back. And then of course, then the RFP process starts its turning its multiple turns to get down to the final vendor. And then of course somebody will challenge it, and it takes years to work its way through. But but there is a healthy mix, I guess is what I'm saying, between developing things in-house and then relying on the private sector to also bring their best solutions to the table as well.
Yeah. My previous career, I was in the VA, and I'm hearing some of the scar tissue that I have from that experience in some of your comments too. But I think you're right. It is a balance, and certainly from my limited experience at our own healthcare system, sort of thinking about that right partnership does seem to be a promising area. So
Tom,
Matt,
if I may, I don't think just to add on that, I don't think any of us can innovate well without partners. At Medtronic, we need our physician partners. We need our health system partners. And you talked about just delivering insulin, Alex. I would say we're focused on driving investing in a personalized closed loop for patients, where we take the input from physician, their diet, their exercise, their sleep habits, their all of the things that make up a person, to ultimately try to become the true artificial pancreas. And we're investing heavily in that. We have engineers in Israel working around the clock on it, and we couldn't do it without partners, or we need partners.
Yep, totally agree.
Matt, maybe I'll ask you a bit, a slightly different question, but very related, and that's on the implementation side of things. So, going on with these partner conversations, as you start to see these innovative companies in the services space and other parts of healthcare, my understanding is your model with your limited partners, which are almost exclusively health systems, that they essentially serve as your test bed to see if those particular innovative companies' products work in healthcare systems and thus have value to the overall system. Assuming that's true, and correct me where it's not, is that, has that been a fruitful way to understand the value of your investments? Has it shaped your investment portfolio? And has it had any unintended consequences? Have healthcare systems gotten distracted focusing on some of these investments, maybe to the detriment of their overall healthcare operations?
It's a wonderful question, Tom. Let me start off by saying the number of entrepreneurs going after these root cause problems for health systems is at all-time highs. Folks have a tsunami of entrepreneurs who are getting coached up, who are reaching out to them. What they need is a curator. And in many respects, that's the role we're playing. We are curating the tsunami of companies And then in our model, it's a little different than the way you characterized it, which is our job is to make the investment decision, but we base that on our active model, which requires engagement from our, over our history, 18 health system partners. They do not have to become a customer, but we want their feedback and collect the collective feedback of this microcosm to feed into the decision we make, which is the investment decision. I compare and contrast this to a traditional independent fund that is usually paying experts to provide their expert opinion, or a single health system who's relying on their experts of one system. What we are doing is collecting this wisdom from a dozen or so health systems and using that to guide our investment decision. Now, quite often, if we do a good job listening, which gets harder over these Zoom calls, by the way, because you can't read body language so well, but if we do a good job, in many situations, the companies we invest in end up getting adopted by our limited partners. We do not get involved in those contract negotiations. We make the investment decision, the health system makes the purchasing decision.
Gotcha. And that seems like that is helpful. That's an elegant way of both you're almost creating your own market intelligence in a really substantive way, rather than simply relying on the random doc you pull off the hallway you see in your own health system, but rather get a larger sample size and a bit more validation in that way.
And Tom, it only works if you're delivering value to the health system partners who are hearing from not just their system, but others. And then if you're delivering value to those portfolio companies, because if you can't advise or guide them around marketing, product, sales, their dollars are becoming commoditized, and you really need to have a differentiated model given how many dollars are out there. As Karen said, the private equity guys are moving down into venture. They're partnering with large companies like Medtronic. So capital is becoming commoditized. So the question is, what's your differentiation?
That's right. That's right. Let me turn the conversation. We've got about let's do about five more minutes or so, and then we'll turn over to some questions. But I wanted to speak a little bit, Alex, to your newish role in community health. And what's new is old again. What's old is new again, because I know you've been doing the various capacities over your career. But tell us a little bit about that role, what it means, why SSM Health has it, and what your aspirations are for it.
Yeah. So I moved from being the chief medical officer to the chief community health officer, and let me explain a little bit of why we made this shift. And so I think really the pandemic just sort of pushed it along faster than we had been anticipating it. And part of that rationale was when we were looking at who was being impacted the most with the pandemic, it was clear that there were populations that were more at risk, particularly the Black and the Hispanic populations. And the reason wasn't because they were inherently more at risk of disease. It was because of other issues, what people call the social determinants of health. And so, as a Catholic healthcare organization, a not-for-profit organization, we feel this is one of our missions is to address some of these barriers out in the community. As many of you know, the delivery of healthcare itself only accounts for maybe 15 to 20% of total health in the community. It's all of those other things that really build the health in the community, whether that's environment, whether that's education, whether that's equity, equal pay, things like that. And so our thought is to move further upstream than the delivery of healthcare, to move more into what are those bigger categories that we can impact in order to drive the entire health of the community, and not just at the individual level. It's not exactly new in healthcare, although it's not exactly old either. And so I use the pandemic as a springboard to bring more attention now to how do we address the social determinants, to prevent disease in the first place and to get equity amongst our different communities.
That's great, and certainly agree with the mission. I would say our healthcare system here feels similarly about the
Right.
need to have that role in our community, and it'll be great to join up with you. Let me pretend that I can have Matt sell everything in Ascension Ventures and give it to you in your bank account. And I'm also going to have Karen give you her entire, well, I'll just give her all the revenues that Medtronic makes every year. So you've got that pot of money.
Yeah.
I'm not going to let you go buy anything for yourself. I'm going to make you invest it in the community. Where would you invest it? How would you deploy that kind of capital?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Tom, and it's a complicated answer. So, I think back to the issue of it's either a wicked problem or it's a tame problem. This is definitely a wicked problem, right? So there's no one single answer to it. Fundamentally, when you start sort of breaking this down, asking all the whys, why is there such disparity in the different communities that we serve? There's a huge income gap between the upper reaches of professional service and the majority of people that work for low wages. And so that there certainly has to be some pay equity. We're constantly dealing with issues of institutional racism as well. And I don't think that we can brush over that, that we do have a history in this country that is we have to address, our history of racism. And then all of that sort of follows along with these other issues, whether they're environmental or education or any of these other things. But you have to fix that root cause first. And that's a difficult thing to sort of put your finger on. Like, if I only fix this one thing, everything else would be taken care of. So it's almost a combination of things. So if you ask me, like, what would I do with all that money, I'd probably invest it in government advocacy and work towards policy change across the board. But it's really difficult to say if I just did this one thing, everything would be fine. I think it's a series of things, both fundamental on the ground things, as well as policy change and other things.
Yeah, and it speaks to the sort of theme I'm hearing throughout this conversation of partnership. Yeah. That you really do need the strengths of all these different entities, be it private capital or be it the policy and regulatory pieces the government brings to bear, as well as the care delivery itself from health systems, to try and tackle some of these wicked, I think that's a great adjective, wicked problems. Let me turn a little bit to some of the questions I'm seeing, and I'm going to kind of combine a question. Well, I'll take them separately. So Damon is asking about some of the frustrating things I think we've all seen in the time period where we've had a vaccine and starting to roll it out, and that there is an issue of misinformation out there, that we are seeing, some misguided folks having conspiracy theories or other sort of just mistruths that are out there and that are getting in the way, that are scaring people and then keeping them away from what we know to be a safe and really effective vaccine therapy. I guess, I'll point to you initially, Alex, but I'd love to hear all of y'all's opinion. Mm-hmm. What should we do as a medical and scientific community to help with messaging or education or whatever we believe the root cause is behind some of this misinformation?
Yeah, it's a great question, whoever asked it. So, in some ways I liken this to my time in the military. So when I was deployed, I was with what's called a civil affairs unit, and we're sort of the nation building arm of the military. And then our sister units are the psychological operators. And so in many ways, you have to have a marketing message for the pandemic. Half of the battle is in messaging, which is one of the reasons why we were so aggressive about doing press briefings and getting information out and things like that. But you can't be reactive, you have to be proactive. So you have to get the message out there. And then you do have to combat all of the myths that come up. I would bucket those into a couple of things. So there's sort of the active myth purveyors, the anti-vaxxers, things like that. But there's also a healthy dose of skepticism, especially amongst our more vulnerable populations, which is very well founded from past, mistreatment within the healthcare systems. And you have to address each one of those differently. So you can't just go to some of these communities and say, hey, here's all the data, here's the p-value, here's the odds ratio. You do have to explain to them this is what the science says, but also have a dialogue and allow them to be the decision maker, regardless of if they agree to accept vaccine or not. You have to allow them to make that decision based on all the information. So the other side that's a little bit more caustic, you try and beat that with data, but this other group, it has to be more of a conversation. And you have to have the appropriate messenger as well. Me being a doctor or a scientist, that's not going to be as persuasive as if it's somebody from the community that is advocating for vaccine.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think somewhat related, you bring up the fact that not only in social determinants of health writ large, but also in some of the more COVID-focused areas, we do have communities that lack access to optimal diagnostics, optimal treatments. Maybe Karen, a little bit on the Medtronic side, I know that part of your mission is looking at some of the populations that would benefit from some of the innovations and products that Medtronic has. How does Medtronic reach out to communities that traditionally haven't had the access that they ideally would have to this kind of healthcare?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Tom. And I would say that, it's something that we're working on. We don't have, the perfect solution, but I will say that we are investing more in our brand and in marketing to help deliver those kind of messages. We are also very focused on penetrating the emerging market world with our healthcare solutions. And, we're doing that. We go in and we start by working through distributors, but we end up wanting to go direct as quickly as we can. And so we end up purchasing our distributors, or we end up driving important campaigns in those emerging markets around the life-saving therapies that we have. But it's a never-ending grapple for sure.
That's right. And I just think about your laudable efforts in sharing the ventilator intellectual property, and just I think there's clearly a role for private industry, for-profit companies, just like you guys have illustrated, about how do you contribute to the social mission in addition to the business priorities that Medtronic and others have. I guess, Matt, one question to you related to the community health side of this conversation. I've certainly seen an interest in the venture and startup communities around tackling some of these social determinants of health. One of the ones that I've been closest to is City Block Health, which is out in Brooklyn, and they are taking on at-risk populations and helping both with clinical and social needs to try and optimize their healthcare and participate in some of the savings that might generate. Are you seeing opportunities, either AV or just writ large in the ecosystem, that you think are promising to address some of these social determinants that we've been talking about?
Definitely, Tom. I think this is an important area for all health systems and for all venture firms. And I tend to think on the social determinant side, we see activities taking place in 3 areas. One is food, or food as medicine. Number 2 is housing. Number 3 would be transportation. And you're seeing partnerships with like the Uber Healths and the Lyfts. I think once folks figure out a way to knit those partnership conversations together into a holistic offering, and then when health systems are being paid first dollar risk, that's when the benefits will be realized by the health systems, in addition to the patients getting the benefit from integrating all these services today. But right now, the payers are much more incented to do this than the providers or health systems are.
That's right. I certainly think the person who holds the purse is going to have the first incentive. And right now, as we're set up, that is largely in the hands of the payers and the insurers. All right, well, I guess last question, and then we'll turn it back over to Peter. This will be for everybody. And I would say, just from your perspective, I'd love to hear what you think is one innovation that you have seen come out of the pandemic that you think will still be with us for the years to come. And I guess let me start with Karen, and then we'll go to Alex, and then finally Matt.
Well, clearly, the innovation of all of us being able to connect on Zoom is incredibly important. And honestly, it's enabled greater collaboration for Medtronic with our physicians and our customers around the world. We worked through Zoom at the beginning of the pandemic, trying to help healthcare systems, figure out the right protocols to stay open. And then we clearly have worked beyond that to help drive, continued work in trials and in, greater innovation. One of the trials that we're conducting, which could be a huge medical breakthrough, we were concerned would be put on pause and has not been. And it's around renal denervation, where we can go in and denervate nerves in the kidney to treat hypertension and all of the things that come along with that, comorbid issue. And so we are on track with hopefully getting renal denervation to market sometime soon. And, the amazing breakthrough that could have, even as we worked on it during the pandemic. So.
Wow. Yeah, well, as a cardiologist, I've been following that for a while, and it'll be fun to see what is yielded from your trial. Alex, how about you?
Yeah, so a couple different buckets. So I think from the technology, the pure sort of technology side, I think the role of telemedicine, as Matt mentioned earlier, I think that's here to stay. I think as most healthcare systems realize, we had a 5-year plan on how many people we wanted to be engaged in telemedicine, and we blew past that, multiple times in the first few weeks of the pandemic. And so I think that has been a forcing function to move forward with that. From a more practical side, I would say it is bringing the healthcare sort of thinking together. And so I'll just use an example. Like I didn't, the first time I had met Rich Lightwig from BJC was when we were going to go to a meeting with the mayor and the St. Louis County executive to talk about what are we going to do about this COVID thing. But we've been meeting, multiple times a week throughout the pandemic, and then you start thinking about other things that you can do for healthcare, for the community, for other issues, and I think that has really been beneficial for the St. Louis area.
That's great. And Matt, what about you?
Those were two great answers. The one I would add that we haven't fixed yet is we are going to fix the supply chain issues that we've seen with PPE, testing, gowns, vaccine distribution. I think when we come out of this, we will have solved this so that we will be much better positioned to deal with it in the future. It's going to force us to take on very difficult conversations like China versus America, cost versus keeping it home. But I think we will end up in a much better place when we're done.
Yeah, those are all great comments, and certainly illustrates, necessity is the mother of invention. And although nobody would have wished for the pandemic, I think we can agree that there are some silver linings. And I've appreciated all those innovations. Although it's nice to be able to zoom in, I am looking forward to shaking hands and giving hugs in the not too distant future. But I do hope that all the advantages you guys have described are here to stay. Well, I really appreciate y'all's time. You've been more than generous with it. Really interesting conversation and insights. And Peter, I'll turn it back to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tom, for that fantastic panel. I want to just close this with a few thoughts here as we end together. We've heard a lot about collaboration and innovation in healthcare. The same is true, ironically, with healthcare symposiums. It's hard to imagine that just 1 year ago, basically this week, we were all sitting live listening to Alex Gorski and a few others talk about the future of healthcare. And here we are now a year later with a very different world that's involved. And there's a number of people that are involved to make that possible. I want to thank our panelists straight through from top to bottom, Kristi, Mike, Vineeta, Matt, Karen, and Alex. Your insights were fantastic. Tom, many thanks for your engagement in that second leadership panel as well. And then a few people on the planning side that I want to make sure that we cover as well. First off, thanks to my colleague Bart Hamilton for all his work in healthcare, innovation, family, et cetera. He does everything across the board, and it wouldn't be possible without his work and leadership there. I want to thank as well our healthcare symposium planning team. It takes a lot to pull this together, and the group did a great job. In particular, we had a small group heavily involved. Mark Reifschak, Alicia Haith, and Sean Martin, many thanks to you for your work. And then finally, I want to thank our planning team for healthcare at Olin. We continue to think about what innovation looks like in this space from a curricular and co-curricular standpoint. We welcome your insights around what those partnerships could look like, but a fantastic group that has led the way over the last 6 to 9 months as we've thought differently about our own potential future as a school. And then finally, many thanks to Dean Taylor for leading the vision around what this looks like. He has prioritized a lot of things happening here from innovation to healthcare inside the way that we do our work inside the business school. So once again, thanks to everyone here. It's been great to be with you, and I look forward to seeing you either on Zoom or in a real in-person way sometime in the future. Thanks, everyone.